welcome to our monthly lecture. Wonderful to have you here. Welcome to our members and welcome to our visitors. I know we have a number of visitors who are coming just for today. Again, thank you so much for being here. If you are interested in becoming a member, we can help you do that after the lecture, or if I'd have to come along to a particular lecture, that's fine as well. Before we begin, and before I introduce Ron, who's on my left, we are looking to put together an international trip, a military history trip, as you can see on the screen, and Ron is leading that. So I'll just hand over to Ron just to go through some of those details, and then I'll pop up again to introduce Ron, who is leading our lecture this morning. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. What you see up there on the screen is a tour that we're preparing for next year to have Anzac Day in Athens, and it's a 12 days, 11 nights tour which combines visits to the World War II battlefield sites in Greece and Crete, and also to Greek and Cretan heritage sites. The areas that we cover are battlefield sites are in Greece, not right up north, but down in Thessaly at Livadia, the final withdrawal stock position at Brallas Pass, the Peloponnese and Corinth Canal, and the eventual evacuation beaches at Megara, Navplion and Porto Rafti, as well as around Athens itself. On Crete, we'll be looking at the Suda Bay Malani sector, Retimnon. We'll move across to Heraklion, all locations where Australians and New Zealanders fought, and then follow the general withdrawal route south to the southern coast of Crete to Sparkia, where the bulk of soldiers were evacuated and taken off, and along the coast from there to the Provelli Monastery, where the monks hid the soldiers, Australian and New Zealand soldiers, until submarines could come and pick them up. In addition, we'll be looking at cultural sites in Greece, Athens, the Acropolis, Olympia, Delphi, the home of the Oracle, and also the battlefield at Thermopylae. Crete, we'll go to Retimno, which is a Venetian town, the Palace of Knossos, the Venetian Villa Museum, which is run by the Greek army as a military museum, and also Heraklion, where we will look at the area there. So down there at the bottom is the pricing and inclusions, and that's on the basis that we get 20 people to go. There are some printed flyers up on the table, and there's also a list for you to register interest so that we can send some more details of the tour out to you.
Thank you, Ron. And if anyone knows anything about international travel, that price is a very good price. What is not included, obviously, is the airfare, but that would be up to you. I'm sure there's some really good deals out there if you're interested. Not that I can help you with that, but I know that there are some really good deals. So again, something to consider for next year. This morning I've got the privilege of introducing our Vice President of the Military History Society, Ron Lyons. Ron is a retired Lieutenant Colonel in the Army Reserves and subsequently a military historian and a battlefield guide. He's also the Vice President of the Royal United Services Institute for Defence and Strategic Studies here in New South Wales. And this morning, Ron will take us through the probably very undiscussed and unknown Operation Exporter, one of the most probably misunderstood, forgotten campaigns of World War II. It was a complicated mixture of strategic imperatives around airfields and oil, political, diplomatic manoeuvring and improvisation with scarce military resources. Okay? So we put our hands together and welcome Ross.
Thanks, Rob, and good morning again, ladies and gentlemen. Well, the talk today is titled Don't Mention the War, and although that's something I've grafted from an episode of Fawlty Towers, as we go along you'll see that there are some elements of a Fawlty Towers episode in this operation. As Rob has said, fighting the French in Syria and Lebanon, 1941. For me, that's the third in a trilogy of campaigns that the Australians fought in the Middle East that was not in the Western Desert. And so people fighting the French, and people are a bit confused by that, but I'd just like to take you to the 1968 movie The Charge of the Light Brigade, where the British and French and Turks were fighting the Russians. And there's a scene where Lord Raglan, the British Commander-in-Chief, who had been at Waterloo, is sitting on the veranda of his headquarters and sees a troop of French cavalry riding towards the building. He gets highly agitated, starts pointing and yelling, "The French, the French," until his aide whispers in his ear, "My lord, they're on our side this time." And in this particular campaign, the French were on everyone's side. So, why are we fighting the French? And it's a little-known campaign, and we'll see some of the reasoning for that as we go through it. So what we're going to do in the presentation is to look at the story so far, why it happened, what was the aim of it, what was the overall timeline of the 5-week campaign, who were the Vichy French, who comprised the Allies in this operation, and who were the commanders, the opposing forces and their strengths. We'll look at the ground, and we'll look at the plan, we'll look at how it was prepared, and an overview of the conduct of the operation, and the results and the aftermath of what happened. So if we go to the story so far, in June 1940, metropolitan France fell to the Germans. The French government was allowed to continue to govern at the spa town of Vichy in southeastern France in what was designated the free zone. In other words, the Germans couldn't afford to occupy the entire country, so occupied the northern part of France, which of course at that point in time was a preparation for Hitler's invasion of Britain. And so the Germans allowed them to govern as what was known as Vichy France, as a German proxy state. And the Vichy government also controlled French possessions in North Africa, the Levant, and Indochina. Now, the Levant was the region that was described as Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and then called Transjordan, what we know today as Jordan. However, Jordan, at that point in time, was under the auspices of the British. In July 1940, General de Gaulle, who'd escaped from France, establishes the Free French government in exile in London. And he gathers around him those French soldiers and civilians who managed to escape through Dunkirk and other places to England in 1940. However, in terms of troops, he's only got about 300 troops there with him. So he's keen to build up a Free French force that will go and fight alongside the Allies and gain territory, or gain back territory for France. So in November 1940, England puts the Vichy French government further offside by trying to take the French fleet into custody at a place called Mers el Kabir on the North African coast. The result of that is that negotiations break down and the Royal Navy opens fire on the French fleet and 1,200 French sailors are killed. You can imagine they didn't take that kindly. So early in 1941, de Gaulle agitates with the British government to take action against Vichy-held Syria. He sees the forces in Syria as somewhere where he can gain control, and he can also gain a substantial army to back what he's trying to do. In April 1941, a man by the name of Rashid Ali and the Golden Square movement stage a revolt in Iraq, and they besiege the British RAF base at Habaniya airfield with German assistance. The revolt is quashed in May by the British Hab Force and the Arab Legion. We'll see what happens with them a bit later on. But critically, in May 1941, the Vichy Admiral Darlan signs the Paris Accords, which allowed German aircraft to stage through Syria on their way to support the uprising in Iraq, and also agrees to use the Syrian railways to sell French war stores to support the Iraq rebellion. Now naturally, this is starting to get too close to Suez and the Canal Zone. Turkey also gets nervous about German activities in Syria and moves forces up to its border. At this stage, the Allies were negotiating with Turkey to try and come over to the Allied side. That never eventuated. So in May 1941, German agents, aircraft and technicians start arriving in Syria and Lebanon. On the 30th of May, the Iraq rebellion fails and Germany starts to extract aircraft and personnel back through to Syria. At this point in time, Hitler determines that he won't carry out any operations in the Levant until after he has dealt with Russia. So the campaign Operation Barbarossa to take on Russia is foremost in his mind. And so on the 6th of June 1941, all the German personnel and equipment have gone from the area. So basically, the perceived enemy has gone. So who were the Vichy French? Well, that map is a little bit indistinct, but you can see there that France was divided into a German occupation zone, and then the free zone, which was under Vichy control. Down here on the southeastern side is a little green area, which is where, once the Germans invaded France in 1940, Italy decided it would invade too and grab a bit of territory while nobody was looking. Okay, why did it happen? Well, three things: political, strategic, and military. The French influence in the Levant started with the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1918. That was where France and Britain divided up who would get what in the post-World War I settlement. And this is where things happened, like Churchill and one of his offsiders took a map and a ruler and a pencil and sort of carved out arbitrary boundaries in the Middle East area, and probably caused some of the problems that we are still with us. Establishment of free French control in the Levant. This is what de Gaulle was continually agitating about. He wanted to establish free French control there, and of course Britain saw that that could be a buffer against any incursions from the north towards the canal zone. Strategic reasons why it happened. As we said with Greece and Crete, it's all about airfields and oil. And airfields were the aircraft combat ranges. How far could the plane reach to bomb or strafe particular areas? And so, if the Vichy French still and Germans still controlled the three main airfields at Beirut, Rayak and Damascus, they could affect Palestine and eventually down into the canal zone. So there were perceived threats to the Nile Delta, Suez and the gateway to India, and that whole area is a strategic pathway and has been for many centuries. The other key thing was the Iraq and Persian oil wells. And they came from Persia and Kirkuk in Iraq, and they went across the country through Syria and through Lebanon to coastal pumping areas and storage areas on the Mediterranean at Haifa and Tripoli. The military aspect, allowing German military planes to land and refuel in Lebanon and Syria to support the Iraq revolt, with the possibility of reinforcement and advance across Suez Canal, across towards the Suez Canal. So on the map there you can see that they saw the threat as the possibility, if Turkey joined the Axis, to come down and invade the area that way. They saw the possibility of the Russians coming from the Caucasus, cross into the oil areas, and of course the possibility of an approach to the canal zone. So what was the aim of what became known as Operation Exporter? It was really to seize the Vichy-controlled airfields at Beirut, Rayak and Damascus. It was to protect the flow of oil along the pipelines from Kirkuk to the Mediterranean coast. And it was also to help to consolidate de Gaulle's post-war position in France. De Gaulle was playing what they call the long game here. He knew what he wanted at the end of the war, and this was the way to get it. He had to have an army, and he'd already convinced the Allies to carry out two abortive missions in it on the west coast of Africa, where he would turn up and declare, as he declared everywhere, "Je suis la France," I am France, rally to me. The reaction wasn't exactly what he expected. Both of those operations ended in costly debacles and evacuations. So he now saw the prize as being Syria and the Levant. Okay, on that map you can see the pipelines coming in from Persia through Iraq and across to the coast. And also that one down there that came up at Haifa. Now, the three airfields, I'm sorry the map is a little bit small, but the three airfields were at Beirut, Rayak and Damascus. And that became the focus of the operation. So, who were the Vichy French? Okay, going from the left of the slide, there was Marshal Henri Pétain, who was the head of the French government. In 1940, the 83-year-old Marshal Pétain, the hero of Verdun in the First World War, was grasped from the arms of his mistress and told that he was going to head the Vichy government. So he was mainly, it turned out that he managed to try and appease the Germans, but he turned out to be mainly a figurehead. If we just duck back quickly to 1911, Colonel Pétain was the CO of a lieutenant Charles de Gaulle. And Charles de Gaulle had a pretty iffy performance record, which Pétain decided to give him the benefit of the doubt and sign it off that he was okay. We'll come back to that later. In the middle was Admiral Darlan, who was the Deputy Premier. He had previously been the Minister for Marine, but he was basically became the person who ran the day-to-day operations of the Vichy French government. The man on the right-hand side was General Henry Dentz, and he was appointed the French High Commissioner and commander of the army of the Levant. So he was the senior Vichy French man in the area that we're going to talk about. So, who were the Free French? Well, so we have General Charles de Gaulle, as we've said, who was appointed himself head of the Free French government in exile, and went around badgering Churchill, badgering Roosevelt, who thought he was something of a nut, to garner support for his cause. His representative, over on the other side of the slide, his representative in the Middle East was General Petrou, and he was based in Cairo, where he continually badgered Allied commanders there to give him support and give him resources to go and attack Syria. The man down the bottom, General Le Gentilhomme, was the commander of the Free French forces in Syria. That started off with about 300 troops and gradually but slowly built up from there. Who were the supporting players in all this? Well, in Lebanon and Syria, there was the Italian Armistice Commission, and it was there supposedly to supervise partial demobilisation of French colonial forces. Apparently, all they did was stay in Beirut in highly polished uniforms, giving each other salutes. The other group was a German group known as Fliegerzug Iraq, which were German agents, equipment, technicians and aircraft supplied by Hitler to support the Vichy French and the revolt in Iraq. Now those are the people who were there in Iraq and running the staging operation through the airfields in Lebanon and Syria, and then eventually were pulled out on the 6th of June 1941. And so you can see from this slide that what they did was they oversprayed the swastikas on their planes and replaced them with the French emblem on the tailplane. That was part of the deception plan. So who were the allies? Well, there's the heads of government, Winston Churchill and General de Gaulle. Down on the bottom left is the overall theatre commander in the Middle East, General Sir Archibald Wavell. And Wavell was a guy who had, at that point in time, about 6 different operations running over the course of the African continent, and indeed the Near East. And he didn't have the resources or frankly the time to mount some sort of operation to go and attack the Vichy French. The Deputy Theatre Commander in the Middle East was our own, and Commander of the Australian Imperial Force in the Middle East was our own General Sir Thomas Blamey, who had been the commander of one Anzac and one Australian Corps in Greece and Crete, and was now back in Cairo as the Deputy Theatre Commander. So if we look at the other commanders, the commander appointed for Operation Exporter was General Sir Henry Jumbo Maitland-Wilson. You can't see there because he's sitting down, but his immense size gave rise to his nickname. and he was the General Officer commanding Palestine and Transjordan. He was appointed for that. He was a great friend of Churchill, and for some reason survived Greece and Crete and several other debacles in the Middle East to eventually become a Field Marshal and become the Commander-in-Chief, Middle East and Italy. And he was going to run the operation from his headquarters in the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which was 100 miles, literally 100 miles from the battle scene. So you can just imagine how much influence he would have had on the course of operations. Over the other side is the one of the field commanders, Major General John Laverack, who was then the GOC of 7th Australian Division. 7th Division had arrived in the Middle East and was in Palestine training and equipping. It hadn't taken part in any operations yet, except for its 18th Brigade, which was in Tobruk. So at this stage, out of the usual 3 brigades that a division had, he had only 2. He had no divisional cavalry, and he was given, because his divisional cavalry was sent to garrison Cyprus, and so he was given resources from 6th and 9th Divisions, the other 2 divisions, Australian divisions there. So he then was GOC 7th Division until the 18th of June 1941, when 1 Australian Corps was reactivated, and he had his headquarters at Nazareth and then moved forward. The other field commander here, over here on this side, is Major General Arthur Tubby Allen, who became the GOC 7th Aus Div from 18th of June 1941. Tubby Allen was a militia officer. He was an accountant from Hurlston Park here in Sydney, and one of the top commanders in the AIF in the Second World War. So there were some other commanders there. There was Central and Northern Syria and Iraq, and that was Had Force, which are the people who'd gone and put the Iraq revolt down, and that was commanded by Colonel Kingston, and that had British, it was mainly a British force. It had British cavalry and both horsed and mechanised, and it had the household cavalry making a rare appearance east of Suez, but that was part of a highly mobile force that was to be used on the right flank of the operation. The Arab Legion was Arab troops commanded on behalf of the King of Transjordan by British Colonel John Bagot Glum. A very formidable force that played a great part in the operation itself. And right up north, coming out of Persia and heading west across to the coast, was the 10th Indian Division, which was commanded by then Major General William Slim, later on to become a Field Marshal and a Governor General of Australia. So now let's look at the relative strengths. So the Allies had about 34,000 ground troops. They had 70 aircraft, which included Blenheim bombers, when they could get hold of them. There was the 12 P-40 Tomahawk fighter aircraft of number 3 Squadron RAAF, and there were also some ancient Gloucester Gladiator biplanes that were being used. Their naval assets were 15 Cruiser Squadron Royal Navy, which comprised two cruisers and 5 destroyers, one of which was HMAS Perth. Now we'll look at the other strength in detail, but the Vichy French had at their call 65,000 troops, 35,000 trained troops, I say trained troops, and 30,000 local troops, including Syrian infantry, Circassians and White Russians. However, what they did have was 150 medium and light tanks. Now, the One Corps and the Allies had nothing like that. They had Bren gun carriers of different marks. Bren gun carrier carried a Bren light machine gun in it, and there was also a variant which carried a larger, heavier Vickers gun. That was about the extent of our tank and mechanised strength. They had 100 aircraft, including fighters and bombers of their own. This is nothing to do with the German aircraft that were there. And they also had 2 to 3 destroyers and a submarine. So one Australian Corps had 21st Brigade, 25th Brigade, and later on 17th Brigade. But to start the operation, Laverack had 21st Brigade, 25th Brigade, and 5th Indian Brigade. A 5th Indian Brigade was an Indian Army Brigade which had 3 battalions, 1st Royal Fusiliers, 1st Battalion Punjabi Rifles, 1st Battalion of the Rajputana Rifles. Later on in the operation, 6th British Division came into the picture after the 18th of June. And of course down the bottom was the 1st Light Free French Division under Major General Le Gentilhomme. And that comprised the few troops that he had, plus the troops that he kept on trying to win over from the Vichy French side to join his force. So you can just imagine how much information about the operation was leaking out of the place. Okay, so to boost his mechanised strength, Laverack was given the 6th and 9th Division Cavalry Regiments. He was also given the 2nd, 3rd and 2nd, 5th Infantry Battalions, Australian Infantry Battalions, who had come out of the Greasy Creek fighting. And he had Royal Scots Greys and the Royals, that's more mechanised and horsed. And he had C Battalion Special Service Brigade Commandos. In addition, each side had local forces, right? The Allies had the PARMAC, which was a Jewish paramilitary intelligence organisation in Palestine. They went all over the countryside gathering intelligence information and also carrying out small raids. They later became part of the Haganah and eventually part of the Israeli Defence Force 7 years later. There was the Druze tribesmen who were a combination of Christian, Muslim and pagan believers who were tribes in the local area, as were the Alawites, who were a different religious sect, but also supplied local troops. The Vichy French had the Lebanese militia, also had the Druze, because at this stage, local people wanted their independence, and they didn't know who was going to win the war at that stage, so they decided it was going to be an each-way bet. And so they had different people supporting each side. Also the Syrian levies, who believed that they were fighting for their independence because they'd been agitating the French government to give them their own government, as had the Lebanese. So if we look at the ground now, and we look from where the start was at the Palestine border, I'm just trying to maneuver my thing there. There was the route up the coast through Acre, Tyre, Sidon to Beirut. Now, that was a traditional route for invaders for thousands of years. It was a traditional crusader route. And so you had the airfield at Beirut, and then the coast went on up to Tripoli. Across here, you had Rayak, and across here at Damascus, you also had the capital of Syria. But what you had was a thin coastal road, and then you had these two mountain ranges, the Lebanon range, which came down there, and the anti-Lebanon range, which came down on that side. Down here in the bottom corner, you had another high ground area called the Jebel Druze, which was the home of the Druze people. And so out here in the middle, you had a lot of open desert. But if you went up along the centre, up the Bekaa Valley, then you got into very rocky territory and also very enclosed valleys. And so we'll just have a look now at the different sectors. So on the coast sector, you had, as I said, a very narrow route along the coast, and it was intersected by two rivers, the Litani and the Darmur River. So if we go back, you've got the Litani River coming out of the hills there to the coast, and further up here, you've got the Darmur River coming out of the mountains there and to the coast near Darmur. So this is what you have, a very narrow route, and as you can see, very steep ground coming down to a very narrow ledge and then falling away to the ocean. And so what this did was narrow the entire thing, and it was ideal for the defenders, because what they did was they put obstacles wherever they could. They also lined the high ground in areas where they dug into the high ground. They lined the areas with machine gun positions which covered the route as it went up. Also, the place was studded with old Crusader castles and fortifications, which they used to their advantage with machine gun posts and wire. In the central sector, you had the Bekaa Valley going up there, and as you can see, fairly rocky heights on either side. But you can see the steepness of the country there wasn't so good for vehicle movement, very, very restricted, and also any armoured vehicle movement. And it was also, it protected the forces there from aircraft attack, but also we only had 3 field regiments of artillery with 25 pounders. And our force had no mortars whatsoever. And so it was restrictive as to how you could fire artillery in that very close country. Because if you're firing a howitzer, which is a high angle type gun, then the thing that you've got to be very careful of is a technical term we used to call in the Nordic platoon crest clearance. In other words, that when you fire the shell, it actually goes over the top of the ridgeline and goes to your target. And so we had no mortars, which would have been ideal in this type of country. But this was definite infantry country. It was steep, it was rocky. You had to climb anywhere to get an advantage and to assault an enemy position. Okay, over on the desert sector, it was right out there in open country, and you can see Bren gun carriers of different types moving along through that area in the approaches up to Damascus and the northern desert flank. So this had both highly mechanised forces and also some regiments. The British division had some yeomanry regiments, which are like reserve cavalry regiments, and a couple of those still had horses. And so they were quickly moved across to the central sector, where they were better used in the more rocky and higher country. Okay, if we look at the Vichy ground forces, the critical thing here is the first one, the 6th Regiment of the Foreign Legion. 4 battalions of the Foreign Legion, and the Vichy French had a battalion on every approach. These guys were the core, of the entire Vichy forces in the area. And they were the cornerstone of the entire defence. Along with them, you had a lot of France's North African troops. So you had the tirailleurs, who were light infantry. Tirailleurs actually means firers, so rifle regiments, from their various North African colonies. You had the local forces, the troops spéciales of Lebanese and Syrian. You had the chasseurs d'Afrique, which were cavalry, chasseurs being hunters, and the spies were North African cavalry and infantry. You also had what they called cavalry spéciale, which was local native Druze, Jira, Circassians, and that, and you had artillery. Importantly, down at the bottom here, they had 90 Renault R35 tanks and 50 Renault RT tanks, lighter model. So they had 140 tanks, and we had sort of Bren gun carriers with light machine guns and that sort of thing. They also had 180 Dodge White Scout cars, which they'd dredged and repaired and got going and all that sort of thing. So if anybody has ever been in a White Scout car, okay, well, they were issued to us in the reserve during the Vietnam era when the M113 APCs were taken and used in Vietnam. So they were an American leftover from the Second World War, but an amazingly agile and hardy vehicle. And out of that, they also had what they called 5 camion de cavalerie, which was a truck or a scout car base with twin 37mm guns, a light machine gun and a mortar which could be fired from the vehicle. So there were some pretty powerful forces. And so you can see up in the top slide there, one of the Vichy French outposts, that they had these little outposts all over the place protected by wire and with machine guns. The other top one is the Renault R35 tank, and then down at the bottom are some of the African infantry and French artillery. So let's look at the preparation for Operation Exporter, because Wavell didn't want to do it, Churchill forced him to do it, and so he said, exporter is in the nature of a gamble, but if I've got to do it, I'll try and scrape as many forces as I can and resources to try and do it. But the preparation was what I call a boy's own adventure type approach. They firmly believed that, and they firmly believed the French, and they firmly believed that all they had to do was appear with a white flag and a megaphone in front of the Vichy French positions and call the soldiers over to their cause, and that would be it. They thought that they'd cross the border and they would be straight up the coast road and in Beirut before you knew what happened, collecting a whole lot of additional soldiers from the Vichy French along the way. They had no appreciation of the time and space involved. They had no appreciation of what we've just talked about the ground, about how good or bad it was and what you could put along it. So they had a rigid adherence to one approach, and that was up the coast road. So they made a very false appreciation of the likely enemy locations, of their strength, of their capacity, and of their morale. And they refused to listen to local intelligence advice. This was coming from the local Arabs and also from the Kalmak, the Jewish group who were gathering intelligence advice across the border and feeding it back, and about strengths and positions and all that, and they wouldn't listen to it. They had a very poor deception plan. They originally started off by trying to put the concentration of 7th Div near the border as being, well, it's just a relief. You know, we're not going to come across the border. It's just a relief of one lot of units from another. We're just changing over. Well, of course, that lasted all of about 10 seconds because every time the soldiers and that stopped, all the local Arab traders appeared to sell their wares, and no matter how many times the soldiers sort of shooed them away, of course, they not only took away their wares, they took away information as well, which they passed on, probably for a price, to the French, Vichy French. So the other part of the deception plan was that they wanted the Australians to wear pith helmets to give the impression that it was British formation that was there at the border, and the Australians weren't anywhere to be seen. It was then, they changed their mind then and decided that just before the operation started, they wanted the Australians to wear their slouch hats so that when the Vichy French saw them, they would welcome their old comrades from the First World War and come over to their side. And as the history says, that after the first few shots that were fired, the slouch hats quickly came off and the tin helmets came on. So they made no concentrated effort to concentrate their force against one particular part of the objective. And as you'll see when we look at the plan, they had 3 different south to north approaches and one enveloping move right around the north from the direction of Iraq and Persia. So they couldn't devote enough resource to each of the 3 approaches. And there was little unity of command. Although Laverack was put in charge of the whole thing and then eventually became the corps commander and responsible for the whole operation, the Free French were allowed to do their own thing and wouldn't come under his command at all, so that was hampering the start of the operation as well. And of course, we go back to where we talked about the Germans. They didn't know that the Germans had left the area before the operation even started. The Germans left on the 6th of June 1941. The operation commenced on the 8th. So, on the 8th of June, in 9th of May, Catroux tells Wavell that he can move his 4,000-man Free French force if the British give him vehicles. Catroux, in fact, lied to Wavell by telling him that the Germans had moved into Syria to take over the entire place, and that was why he should give him all these resources to go and attack them. So on the 8th of June, we look at the overall timeline. The Operation Exporter commenced. On the 16th of June, the Vichy French did a highly unexpected thing, counter-attack, and pushed the Allies back. And on the 10th of July, Damascus, Rayak and Beirut, the 3 airfields, were now captured. And on the 11th of July 1941, a ceasefire was declared, and on the 12th, an armistice was signed. So if we look at that map, that shows us the overall area and the fact of the 3 thrusts towards the this is probably a better one, and it shows you the coastal route, the inland route. Sorry, I'm trying to maneuver mine. But from Palestine, you can see the 4 arrows going up the coast. And in the centre, you've got the forces going up the Bakar Valley and then across the range to the coast. And out on the desert flank, you can see the arrows of where they're going through the desert in Syria towards taking of Damascus, and then across towards the coast at Beirut through the mountains. And way up on the top corner, you can see the arrow coming into the area, which is the 10th Indian Division, coming across from Persia and northern Iraq towards the coast at Tripoli, which was phase 2. So if we look at the conduct of the whole operation, the idea was that on the coastal route, 21 Brigade would cross the border and it would go up through Haifa and it would approach, it would quickly go up through Haifa, Acre and Tyre and approach the Litani River and cross the Litani River. To assist them, there was a commando assault by the commando planned as a sea landing on the northern side of the Litani River so that they landed behind the Vichy French. And of course, remember, we were going to put up the white flag, have the megaphone, and they would all lay down their arms and join us gladly. Okay, what happened was 21 Brigade started up the coast. As it got close, the Vichy French blew the bridge on the Litani River. The commando was mistakenly put ashore south of the Litani River. Half of it was put ashore south of the Litani River, arrived disorganised and was engaged by friendly fire by the Australian battalions because they thought somebody was attacking them from the flank. And the other half that landed north of the Litani River was captured by the Vichy French, and the CO of the commando, in fact, was killed during this operation. So that area didn't get off to a good start. In the centre, 25 Brigade advanced up through Rosh Pinna and up towards Fort Khayyam and Mir Jayun, and they had more success moving up there, but it was hard going, and they were on their way towards Jazim, which you can see up there in the middle on the range. But again, it was hard going through narrow country and it favoured the defence every step of the way. Out on the desert flank, they started and the Free French and the elements of the 5th Indian Brigade started and firstly got to Kenitra, to the road junction there, and then they started on the other route there, which you can see from Daraa, going north directly up to Damascus. And to give you another example of this overconfidence about what the Vichy French would do, at Daraa there was a British man called Hugh Foote, who was the local British political agent. And he was well known to all the local people as a man of justice and iron. And so he rolled up in his car with his Free French officer with him, with the white flag and the megaphone, and they walked forward towards the Vichy French positions, and the Frenchmen called on them to surrender and join the Free French cause. The response to that was that they put an anti-tank round right through the engine block of the car. Foote then removed his hat, gave an extremely theatrical bow, turned around and walked back to the front lines of the... and this is what happened all along the way that they tried to do this. Every time they tried to supposedly win them over, it didn't eventuate. But out on the desert flank, Brigadier Lloyd's 5th Indian Brigade had made good progress, but he only had 3 battalions, and you can see the expanse of the country there. He's trying to spread it across a huge area, and this is where the situation then came to grief. He got to Kenitra, and then he pushed on, and then he was halted near Syria-Lebanon and attacked by Free French soldiers, Vichy French soldiers and aircraft, and forced to a halt because he nearly, at this stage, nearly lost all of his battalion of the Royal Fusiliers, and his other 2 Indian battalions were under heavy attack. So, as I said, unbeknownst to everyone, on the 15th, remember the operation started on the 8th, on the 15th, the Vichy French counterattack. And one group attacked out of the, if you look down at the bottom of the map, the red arrow attacked out of the Jebel Druze towards Sheikh McCain, and suddenly attacked part of the 5th Indian Brigade there and the Free French, and virtually Lloyd suffered more casualties amongst his 2 battalions there. However, they also attacked him at Kenitra. You can see the 2nd arrow coming down there, red arrow coming down there. They attacked him at Kenitra, and he barely held on there, and he was pushed out, but then attacked back again, and then he decided that they got round behind him. He was surrounded, so the only thing that he was going to do now was continue the advance on Damascus. So he decided to then fight on, and that sort of stopped the Vichy French in their tracks. They didn't expect that he would do that. So they pushed on then towards Damascus. And remember that these assaults by the Vichy French were accompanied by a large amount of artillery, and certainly all those Renault tanks, but those turned out to be not as mechanically good as they thought they might be. And the Vichy French didn't like using the tanks at night. So after a certain effort, the tanks suddenly pulled back. And you can see the centre red arrow there coming down from Rayak down the Bakar Valley. They pushed 25th Brigade off out of Murjayoun and out of Jazim, which they had taken, and pushed them right back and nearly outflanked them there. But again, suddenly on the 16th, the French didn't push their advantage any further, and so we were able to assault back after reorganising, assault back and retake Murjayoun and move on to Jazim. But this was a critical point in the operation, and at this point, somebody realised that there wasn't enough force being able to be exerted to conclude the thing. And what happened then was that Laverack became the corps commander. He was given the 6th British Division, which was brought up from the Delta somewhere, and he was also given Brigadier Savage's 17th Brigade, Australian Brigade, to assist there, because the 5th Indian Brigade was just about down to about 200. Out of the brigade, which should be about 3,000 or 4,000, was down to about 200 people, which Brigadier Lloyd was still moving on towards Damascus. And so, in the reorganisation, Laverack then pushed the 17th Brigade up the middle through Jazim to attack Jazim and come down onto the coast road at Damour, and also to assist 25th Brigade in getting over the mountains and on towards Rayak. And over on the other flank, the 6th British Division then attacked on 2 axes towards Damascus, with the Free French somewhere out on his right flank. And what was happening was that every time the Free French struck a Vichy French position, they would all halt and try to convince these guys to lay down their arms and come over to them. And then there was all this parleying under white flags and much toing and froing between front lines, and eventually Laverack and the British Divisional Commander had had enough of this and just sort of left them to one side while they pushed on to go and take Damascus. And in fact, in the words of the soldier from our 2nd 33rd Battalion, the Free French were really a bit of a joke. So after the counter-attack, we then pushed on and pushed the French back and pushed on towards Damascus. Now around Damascus, you can see just near where the circle is there at Damascus, there's a place called Mezay, and you can see where the roadway goes across the mountains towards Beirut. And Damascus was basically isolated, but around Mezay there were about 5 different forts occupied by the Vichy French, protecting the roadway across the mountains towards Beirut through the Barada Gorge. And they proved very hard for the soldiers to dislodge, but were also given, the British commander was given 2nd, 3rd and 2nd, 5th Australian battalions who attacked several of these forts, and one of them, Fort Wagon, one of the company commanders attacked the fort. He eventually ran out of ammunition and they were overwhelmed by the defenders, who tied them up outside the walls of the fort in case any more of the Allies attacked, and they did that as a deterrent to any attack on the fort. And what happened was that the company quartermaster sergeant of that particular company was coming up with his truck and his 2 storemen to resupply the company with food and ammunition and water and what have you. Anyway, he came forward, parked, crept forward with his 2 storemen who were armed. They were all armed with Tommy guns. Crept forward with his 2 storemen, saw what had happened, attacked the guards, freed his company commander and the rest of the company, who rearmed themselves off the guards and various other things they could find, and then they attacked the fort and took it. And so Staff Sergeant Smith, who was the company quartermaster sergeant, was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for that. It's pretty rare that the CQMS goes in, takes them on. Okay, so Damascus, and then they started the fight across the roadway, across the mountains towards Rayak, and eventually, of course, to Beirut. And so in the northeast sector, up in the north, coming out of Iraq and Persia, Hab Force attacked along the northern pipeline towards Tripoli. The critical town of Palmyra, which is a critical junction and pumping station, was captured after a 12-day siege against 187 Foreign Legion troops, who mainly comprised Germans and Russians. So one of the things here was that the Legion wasn't always hugely loyal to the Vichy French, simply because the Legion's motto was, "The Legion is our fatherland," not any other country that they're allied to. However, what happened here was on the northeast sector, because it was so open, this is where the Vichy French used their aircraft to a great advantage, and they slowed the assault down by continued air attacks on vehicles and men in the open country. But then 10th Indian Division moved up and captured Deir ez-Zor and then Aleppo, and that cut the northern sector to the coast and secured the pipeline area. So that's a bit of a busy map, that one, but if you look at that, it shows you the various columns and how they eventually moved along the pipeline, which is the two wiry looking things on the map, across to Homs on July the 9th. And so by July the 9th, the Vichy French, I think, realised that the game was up and started talking about an armistice. And so an armistice was concluded and signed. The armistice of Acre was concluded and signed on the 12th of July 1941, and you can see there in that photograph, on the left of the photograph, Lieutenant General Laverack, in the centre, General Wilson, signing the armistice documents at Acre. General Catroux was also in the room there, and it's said that during a temporary failure of the lighting, his magnificently braided French general's cap went missing. Wilson, of course, blamed one of our soldiers. Not that I think a soldier, but yeah. Catroux wasn't particularly worried, but yeah. So the armistice brought the campaign to a finish. But what were the results? The armistice was signed, the airfields and the pipeline were secured, the threat to Suez and the Mediterranean was negated, and the Germans continued east into Russia under Operation Barbarossa on the 22nd of June 1941. The casualties, Allied casualties, were 8,912 and the Vichy French 6,352. Eventually, Catroux was made the High Commissioner on behalf of the Free French, and he granted Syria independence in November 1941. Lebanon had to wait till 1945 before getting its independence after the war. But what did happen was that Wilson was too lenient with the French officers in the armistice. He allowed them to he allowed the troops and the officers and that to keep their arms, but not their ammunition. And it was discovered that Australian prisoners of war had been sent to France, to Vichy France, after the armistice. In a very shifty move, they were moved through Athens and then by ship overland and into southeastern France to Vichy France. And the result of that was that the Laverack prodded Wilson into threatening to arrest the Vichy senior officers in Syria and Lebanon if the POWs weren't returned. And there was a lot of toing and froing about that, but when 3 Australian brigadiers and their outsiders turned up to arrest the ground force commander, the air force commander and the naval commander, as well as General Dent's, the overall commander, things started moving. And in fact, the POWs were returned in August 1941. 7th Australian Division remained in the area until its departure for Australia in Jan 1942. And it became known for the rest of the war as the Silent 7th. And one of the reasons for that was that straight after the armistice, British censorship descended on the whole thing. They wanted no mention of little mention of the campaign itself. And the emphasis should be on any mention of the campaign that little resistance was offered by the Vichy French. And that's why I started this presentation by saying, don't mention the war, because that's what happened. And in actual fact, a Major Fenton, who was the Australian censor in Cairo, refused to send sanitised versions to the Australian newspapers. So he sent the real story back home to the Australian newspapers, and British newspapers quickly woke up to what was going on and got the Australian newspapers to wire their articles to them so that they could be published in England. Okay, so remember what we spoke about how the Vichy French would flock to the Free French once they were either asked or overcome, right? Of the 35,000 Vichy French troops, only 3,535 elected to join the Free French. And that included only 10% of the Foreign Legion elected to join the Free French. And the remainder were repatriated to Vichy France. And that happened in August through to October 1941 in 17 shiploads of soldiers back to Vichy France. So, what about the whole operation? Failure to concentrate the forces available onto the objective was critical. They just spread themselves out so thin they couldn't get an advantage in any one area. The commander, Wilson, was too far back in Jerusalem to influence the battle. Not that I think he may have been able to influence the battle. He had a habit of commanding battles from hotel rooms. The political interference in ground operations from people like Catrou, de Gaulle and Winston Churchill. And apart from gallantry decorations, such as the one I mentioned about the CQMS, and of course the Victoria Cross awarded to Lieutenant Arthur Rowden Cutler for his actions at Mer Jayoun and Damour. And indeed, you may know that he came, because of his loss of leg, and he came back here to Australia and became the head of the RSL in New South Wales, and in fact worked from offices just up the stairs in this building. And also Private Jim Gordon, who won the Victoria Cross for single-handedly attacking Vichy French machine gun positions on the road from Jazine to the coast. So apart from those gallantry decorations, no campaign clasp to a medal has ever been issued, and it's the same thing for Greece and Crete. Again, I say, don't mention the war where there's an embarrassing result, and that was definitely the case. And in the words of one British officer, we should have left the French alone. And so, with Australians and other Allied forces moved into Damascus and into Beirut, and I recall that a colleague of mine, the late Bill Jenkins, who was a private in the 2nd 3rd Battalion, telling me that when they got into Beirut, he said, we walked into a bar, he said, and it was full of all these Frenchmen, and he said, we used the only 2 words of French we knew. Van Blanc, Van Blanc, Van Blanc. So that brings the campaign to a close. Thank you, and I'm happy to attempt any questions.
Thanks for that. So, am I right in saying that like the Allies were outnumbered and outgunned at the start of the campaign, and that after the Vichy French counterattack, because of the subsequent reinforcements of the 6th British, the 7th Australian Brigade, and the Hat Force that turned the tide?
Yes, yeah, because they could eventually concentrate enough force against one objective, and there was also the feeling that they couldn't understand why the counterattack wasn't pressed more. And it could well be that, you know, they made a counter-attack and honour was satisfied, so they pulled back. The other thing was that Hitler had told the Vichy government that if they didn't defend their colonies, he would take them from them at the end of the war. So General Dentz and all these others, you know, they wanted to put up as good a fight for as long as they possibly could, and then, you know, it was a, well, we made a show of force, but we were overwhelmed, kind of thing. Yes, John?
You mentioned the naval forces where the whole western flank was open, except for Commando fiasco. Did the navies either side do anything?
Yes, the French had 2 ships and a submarine, 2 destroyers and a submarine. They attacked 21 Brigade positions as they went up the coast. In fact, Lieutenant Colonel Potts, who was the CO of 2nd 11th Battalion, later Brigadier Potts, at one stage the French destroyer came in and started chilling them, and he stood up on a rock and said, well, come on you bastards, you missed, have another go. But they took off once the 2nd, 5th Field Regiment opened fire with 25 pounders from the coast and scored a couple of hits. One of the destroyers was sunk further north by a Royal Navy ship from Cyprus, and that sort of ended the Vichy French naval effort. Our naval effort was naval gunfire support on the coast axis. But the thing with naval gunfire support that you need to be aware of is that guns on, apart from anti-aircraft, the main guns on ships are there to kill other ships at long range, and they sometimes have limited elevation, and to try and hit something, unless it's a direct line of sight, it can be noisy and all that sort of thing, but it can be pretty ineffective sometimes, unless you've got a decent target. And it's the same thing with aircraft. Using aircraft, you've got to have a concentration of troops or a target big enough to use it. You can't just sort of go sniping after 1 or 2 guys on a rock. Okay, thank you.
Right, we'll put our hands together for and we thank Ron for his presentation today. I know that I learned a few things that I didn't know about that particular campaign, so again, thank you so much, Ron. Really appreciate it. And I'm sure Ron will be sticking around if you would like to ask him any questions.